grant. Thank you, Jill.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Yesterday was a wonderful day of sessions, and a lot of what was talked about yesterday fits really nicely into today's session. So I'm going to give a really quick introduction into plastic pollution and why we should care, and then I'm going to introduce our main speaker for the day, Chelsea Rockman, who's got wonderful information to share with us. All right. So really quickly, we're just going to talk about some of the problems with plastics. Plastics are an important material. However, our overuse and improper management of plastics have made them a global issue that we see, pretty badly here in the Great Lakes. So first, I want to talk about animal impacts. So a lot of research is being done on animals right now. Chelsea is going to address some of this in her presentation because she's actually one of the scientists doing this research. So plastics have been found in living organisms. And so here you can see the bright green fluorescent. That would be plastic particles in zooplankton, which plankton are the bottom of our food chain. And so these organisms are being eaten by a lot of the other organisms in water environments. So these plastics just accumulate in organisms over time. And then as you can see in the picture to the right, if you do a fish dissection, you can actually find pieces of plastic in the gut of fish. And so is this causing problems? And the answer is yes. There's been some studies done that have shown that organisms that have plastic in them, plankton and fish, it leads to endocrine disruption. So our endocrine system, that's our hormones. And our hormones control everything in our body. So it's altering their feeding, reproduction, growth, and movement behaviors, which pretty much affects every aspect of that organism's life. Also, entanglement is an issue for organisms. A lot of entanglement data has been conducted on ocean systems. However, I recently conducted a little bit of entanglement work with wildlife rehab centers across the state. So for us here in Ohio, birds are the #1 organism that are being brought into rehab centers because they're entangled in some type of trash items. Then you would see mammals, and then you would see reptiles. These animals make sense because if you look at our animals that live in water environments, it's primarily birds, mammals, and reptiles. Fish are typically not brought into rehab centers, but they could be entangled in trash. We just don't see them in the rehab center. And fishing line was the #1 item that was entangling these animals. Then you would look at nets, mesh, and fishing lures. So mesh is actually that landscape mesh that's placed down to help grow grass. And that was actually an item that we weren't really aware of as an issue for our animals. So we really need to work with landscaping companies to change their practices. Also, humans, we are ingesting plastic every day. Our primary source of plastic ingestion is going to be fibers. So we have what are called microfibers. These are small fibers of plastic. They shed from synthetic clothing, so your fleece jackets, your nylon yoga pants, but they're also the plastic filter in cigarettes. So it's been estimated that humans are ingesting hundreds of thousands of fibers a year. That's about 5 grams, which that's about the size of your credit card. And sea salt has the highest concentration of plastic that we've known so far, but that makes sense. It's dehydrated seawater. It's also been found in honey. It's been found in your tap water. Bottled water actually has 2 times more plastic than tap water. Most likely when the lid is screwed on, that lid is made of plastic. Plastic particles come into that water. It's been found in beer. And then within the past couple of years, we've noticed that it is found in human waste. So we are ingesting it, breathing it in, drinking it, but we are also excreting it. Plastic pollution also has a huge effect on our economy. So the Great Lakes have a huge economy for tourism. And if you look at the Ohio portion on this graph, you can see that if we clean our beaches, we're going to see more visitor days, which leads to more dollars being spent and more jobs being created. If our beaches remain filled with trash, we're going to see less visitors coming to these beaches. And so we're going to see the tourism dollars and the jobs go down. So, and we're actually most affected by this in the country. Also, I did a quick study with beach managers, and beaches across the lake, they spend a lot of money keeping these beaches clean. So Menor Headlands, that's a popular beach out where I live. They do a large spring cleanup. So they spend about $20,000 every year on this cleanup. Most of what they clean up is woody debris. So that's stuff that could be composted. It could be put back in rivers to create fish habitat. However, it's so contaminated with these small pieces of plastic that they have to send all of this to landfill because it's not worth their time to try and pick out the stuff that they can save. So it's very expensive to have trash on our beaches. So what we really need to focus on is preventing trash from getting into the system because it's so expensive to clean it up. So that's just a really brief introduction into plastic pollution. So now I'd like to introduce Chelsea Rockman. She is an assistant professor in ecology at the University of Toronto, and she's the co-founder of the University of Toronto Trash Team. Chelsea has been researching the sources, sinks, and ecological implications of plastic debris in marine and freshwater habitats for more than a decade. She has published dozens of scientific papers in respected journals and has led international working groups about plastic pollution. In addition to her research, Chelsea works to translate her science beyond academia. For example, Chelsea presented her work to the United Nations General Assembly and is called upon to advise the provincial and federal governments on policies related to plastic pollution. Through the U of T Trash Team, she leads social science efforts that can directly inform local and global mitigation efforts. So I would like to thank Chelsea for joining us today, and I'm going to hand the presentation over to her. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We will have time for questions at the end of her presentation.
Thank you, Jill. Can you hear me? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I will begin. Thank you. Okay, so hopefully now you can also see my presentation. I just want to start by saying that I'm thrilled to be here. I was really excited to be invited to something called the Cleveland Sustainable Cleveland. I think cities actually have a lot of room to lead. And so it's really exciting for me to talk to cities about this issue. So I'm going to talk about a bit of background on the issue of plastic pollution. I'll talk specifically about plastic pollution here at home in our Great Lakes, and then I'll talk a bit about what I think we can do about it. So I want to start with just basically how I got interested in this issue. And for me, I heard about the garbage patch in 2006. So I learned by reading this article in the Los Angeles Times that there was a lot of plastic floating around in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far from land. And I was curious about how it got there, and I wanted to do something about it. So I decided that I would become a scientist to learn more about it, to be able to allow scientific evidence to inform policy. So, but over the years, this was quite a long time ago in 2006, we've learned that it's not just about the garbage patches, right? There's not just plastic floating around in the middle of the oceans. There's plastic floating around in our oceans everywhere. And this includes the large plastic that Jill talked about that entangles organisms. And then it also includes those small plastics, microplastics, that Jill also talked about in terms of what we are exposed to and what animals ingest. And actually what we've learned is that the majority of the plastic that's floating around in the ocean is microplastic. So by count, most of what is out there are these tiny pieces of plastic that are less than 5 millimeters in size. And this includes all kinds of different polymers that are broken down from different products. So over time, when our water bottle or our fishing net floats around in the ocean in the sun, it breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. And it's smaller and smaller pieces of the type of plastic that's there, the chemicals that are associated with them, and any contaminants that accumulate on them in nature. And these range from the nanoscale to below 5 millimeters. But what we've really learned, I'd say, within this decade is that microplastics are everywhere. This isn't just an ocean issue. This is a terrestrial issue, and this is a freshwater issue, which includes right here at home in the Great Lakes region. And so what I've learned over the course of my career is that they are quite ubiquitous, and that they're similar to other persistent organic pollutants, and that they're persistent, ubiquitous, as I said, and that they can be toxic to wildlife. So let's just take a step back quickly and think about, how did we get here? How did we get to a time when plastic pollution is so common that we're hearing about it in the news almost every day, and that microplastics themselves are so ubiquitous that they're even in the dust? So this is a picture from Life magazine in the 1950s, just after World War II, when the economy was really starting to boom and we were taking on this more convenience lifestyle. And this is when single-use plastics really started to be produced. At this time, we made about 500,000 tons of plastic per year. Today, we produce almost 400 million tons of plastic per year. And in this image, what you're seeing is a celebration of the single-use plastic items and how they can make our life more convenient and how much less dishes we'll have to do. But as we know, this convenient style of living can have its consequences, especially if we're not doing it in a sustainable way. So here I'm showing you a graph from a paper that was published in Science Advances in 2017. And that big blue arrow says that 8,300 million metric tons of plastic has been produced since plastic started being produced. 2,500 million metric tons of that is still in use. It's in the buildings we're sitting in, it's in the computer that I'm talking to you on, and it's in the glasses that are on my face. When we discard that plastic, this is where the unsustainability part really comes in. We currently recycle only about 9% of all plastic that's ever used. We incinerate a similar amount, and sometimes that's into energy and sometimes it's not. But we discard more than half of this material that we've made. Some of it goes into landfills, and that word landfill has a gradient from engineered and maintained and sustained inside the landfill to basically being discarded into the environment. And while we don't know how much has been discarded in an engineered landfill versus into the environment, we can make some estimations using mathematical models. So we published a paper in the journal Science, actually just about a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, where we tried to estimate how much plastic we're putting into aquatic ecosystems annually, which includes our freshwater systems, including our Great Lakes, as well as the ocean. We estimate that in 2016, 19 to 23 million tons of plastic were emitted into aquatic ecosystems every year. That's right here in the 2016 part of the graph. Then we said, if we continue business as usual in this yellow line, how much plastic will be going into the environment in just a decade from now in 2030? If we don't change our habits, we estimate that this number might as much as quadruple to 90 million metric tons by 2030. It's really not in that long of a time. Now, luckily, no one's agreed on this future, and we have mitigation strategies that are suggested to be in place in this blue line. But you can see that this blue line still leaves us around 30 million metric tons of plastic going into aquatic ecosystems. So in this paper, which I'm not going to talk about very much, we estimated how hard do you have to work to get to below 8 million metric tons, which is a number that's commonly been used in the media as the amount that was going into the ocean in 2010. And the reality is we have to work really hard. And so I'll talk about what some of those solutions could be at the end of the talk. But first, I want to focus a little bit on where we are today, which is near the Great Lakes, right? I'm in Toronto, so I'm on Lake Ontario, but I'm not that far from you. And so I want to focus on these lakes that we all live around and probably spend a lot of time recreating and have sort of fallen in love with. So we estimate that about 10,000 tons of plastic enters the Great Lakes every single year. This comes from a paper by Matthew Hopin and his student Hittinger, and this was published in 2017 from Rochester Institute of Technology. This number, of course, will increase, and if we continue business as usual within a decade, you'd expect this to be around 40,000 tons. And this contamination that's going into our Great Lakes has indeed led to the contamination of wildlife. So my student Cole Brookson looked at microplastics in cormorants right here in our Great Lakes and found microplastic in almost every single bird sampled, that's every individual bar, and found that these didn't seem to really relate that much to urban areas or to any particular source, suggesting, as I said before, that this contamination is ubiquitous, and once it gets into the environment, it sort of travels around everywhere and contaminates the system. I have another researcher in my lab, Keenan Munot, who's working on a paper that shows microplastics in sportfish from Lake Ontario. She has also looked at sportfish from Lake Superior. And here you can see that the contamination is there. But the thing I really want to point out is that we sometimes see hundreds of pieces of plastic per individual fish. Now in the ocean, we don't see those concentrations. And the reason is because the oceans are much more dilute than our Great Lakes at home. So in the Great Lakes, there's a lot of urgency to reduce the amount of plastic going into our system. And as Jill mentioned, having contamination in our fish can lead to, or in our environment, can lead to the contamination of the resources that we use. So microplastic in our sportfish can lead to microplastic in the food that we take from the Great Lakes. So here's an example of plastic in fish from Lake Simcoe, so not quite a Great Lake, but large and often included as important in the network. And these are sportfish, and on the left what you see is the amount that's in the gut, the fillet, and the liver of the fish. Of a larger size class, and here is of a smaller size class. But really what I want you to notice here is that these orange and purple bars shows that we didn't just find them in the gut, we found them in the fillet and the liver of the fish. So this suggests that it's moving from the gut into the part that we indeed ingest. And microplastics are also in the drinking water that we pull from the Great Lakes. So I don't study human health. I'm not going to talk about how this could impact humans, and the reality is we don't know yet. There's a lot of people working on this, but I will talk about a bit about how it impacts wildlife, which is what we study in our laboratory. So when it comes to impacts, Jill mentioned entanglement, right? Impacts of plastic pollution can be physical and that they can entangle an animal, but it's hard to imagine a piece of microplastic entangling an animal. But microplastics can still have physical effects in that if they leave the gut and go into different parts of the organism, they can cause inflammation in the tissue, which can eventually lead to tumor production in the worst cases. And they can also kind of, if it's a very small animal and it's a microfiber, sort of entangle around in the gut, similar to a large piece of plastic. The other thing we think a lot about is a chemical effect. So as I mentioned before, plastics are made out of lots of different chemicals. They have chemical additives in them that make them more durable, make them flexible, give them their color, and those contaminants alone could be toxic at high enough concentrations. Also, once plastic enters, let's say Lake Erie, the chemicals that are in Lake Erie will start to accumulate on the plastic. So we see these sorbed or accumulated contaminants that may be pesticides or old banned persistent chemicals that are still around, so legacy pollutants. And so once the plastic enters our Great Lakes, it starts to become this cocktail of chemicals. So my grad student, Kennedy Bucci, asked, do we see an impact of microplastic on fathead minnow? Fathead minnow is a tiny prey fish that's really important to our Great Lakes ecosystem. It's also quite ubiquitous around the world, and it is a common species used in toxicity testing. And she wanted to know, how does plastic that would like just enter the lake, so clean polyethylene or polypropylene, affect the fish? But also, how does the plastic that's already been floating around in the lake, Lake Ontario in this situation, impact the fish, and is it different? And then she wanted to know, does it have a chemical impact or a physical impact? So she put some larval fish in a jar, a glass jar or a small tank, and she either exposed them to no plastic, or she exposed them to the clean or the Lake Ontario plastic, where they actually were in the jar with the plastic. So once they hatched and were able to ingest food, they could ingest the plastic. Or she exposed them to a jar where the plastic was separated from the fish. And in this case, they can only be exposed to the plastic if chemicals leached from the plastic into the water. The different treatments included that clean polyethylene that clean polypropylene, and then plastic that she picked up off the shoreline of Lake Ontario that was a mixture of those two types of plastics ground down to the same size and shape. So what did she find? Well, first of all, she found that there can be a physical impact, and for that clean polyethylene, she found that the high concentration caused significant mortality in the fish. She did not see this with the polypropylene. So there's a difference between plastic type. Yes, it's a physical impact. So we're wondering, maybe is the polyethylene maybe a little bit more durable or a harder fragment than the polypropylene? The polypropylene seemed a bit more soft. But what was really interesting is that for the beached plastic, that Lake Ontario plastic, there seemed to be this increase in mortality across all treatments. And we actually saw significant deformities in this case across all treatments, with more in the high chemical treatment, suggesting in this case that this is a chemical effect from the chemicals that are leaching off. So plastics can have physical effects, they can have chemical effects, and this is true for microplastics as well. And this effect can be exacerbated once the plastic enters the environment and starts accumulating these other chemicals. I found the same thing in polyethylene in the laboratory study in my PhD. I also want to share a project that was led by a postdoc, Anna Kolanaheka, in collaboration with Joanne Parrott, who's at Environment and Climate Change Canada here. We find a lot of tire wear particles in the tributaries of our Great Lakes. We find quite a few, for example, in the Humber River, which leads into Lake Ontario in Toronto. And this tire dust, it comes off of our tires when we drive, and then when it rains, it runs off the road, enters our tributaries, and then eventually enters the lake. So we see it in lake sediments as well. We had heard that these types of plastics are more toxic than some others. So there's a body of literature, scientific literature, that suggests that the chemicals in tire dust can be toxic. So we exposed the chemicals of these tires, again, to fathead minnow, also embryos. And this time we didn't expose them to the tires themselves. We just leached 2 different types of tires in water at different temperatures for 10 days. And then of course also had a control that had no exposure to tires. Then we raised the fish in little well plates in these different leachates from tire 1 and tire 2. I won't tell you the brand because it doesn't really matter. The point is, are different types of tires different? Do they cause different toxicities? And what we found here is that the warmer temperatures seem to leach more chemicals or cause more toxicity to the fish than the colder temperatures, but that the tires did seem to be toxic to the fish. So here you see a reduced hatching success that very much goes in line with the temperature for tire 2, but not for tire 1. So different tires have different chemical formulas. For some reason, this brand is more toxic than the other in terms of hatching success. But for deformities, which is a bit more subtle, right? It's not a killing the fish, is it causing a sublethal effect? Here you see 100% deformity in almost every treatment except the 14 degree of tire 1, which suggests that both tires are causing deformities in the fish. One deformity we found, which we thought was really interesting, is that you can see that fish A that was fed the control diet looks different than fish B and C, and that's in the pigmentation. So for some reason, the chemicals in the tires are causing a lack of pigmentation as the fish develop, and it's particularly common or seen in their eyes. And so we are still studying this to understand what chemical is causing this and how does that impact them as they grow beyond their larval stage. Does it make it so they can't catch a predator, can't escape prey? Do they eventually regain that pigmentation in their eyes, or does it cause something else? So more soon on that, but that just gives you some background on plastic pollution, the contamination of microplastic, and also the impact. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how I think cities can be leaders. We know that plastic pollution is a global issue, and there's no doubt, which means we do need some sort of global coordination in order to help plastic pollution. But we also know that waste is managed incredibly locally, right, at the municipal level. And so cities can really be leaders in terms of acting locally and thinking or helping the global situation. And one of the reasons for this is that in addition to the fact that waste is managed locally, is that a lot of the sources of plastic are coming from urban areas. So while we didn't find a gradient with how much plastic was in the cormorants when it was closer to an urban area or not. When we look at how much plastic is in the Great Lakes in general, we absolutely find that gradient. Closer to urban areas, so the Toronto Harbor is a great example, we have really high concentrations of microplastics in the water as well as in the sediment. And that is because our city is a source of microplastic into our lake. And this comes from various different products that we use in our day-to-day life. And then they enter the lake through different pathways. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those pathways are, which is where we can start to think about mitigation. So these pathways include agricultural runoff, wastewater treatment plant effluent, stormwater runoff, and also industrial effluent. And so I'm going to share a study that I did during my postdoc, which looked at these different pathways to see how much plastic comes from these different pathways, how are they contributing to the lake in our case, or a bay, say for San Francisco or somewhere more marine. And then 3, how do the types of plastics within those different pathways differ, which tells us something about the source or the type of materials that are going into those pathways. So the first thing I just want to show you is the fact that these pathways haven't been studied a ton, right? So plastic pollution has had a bit of an evolution in terms of how we study it. We started studying it in the middle of the ocean. We then slowly made our way back to land. We studied it in terrestrial ecosystems as well as in freshwater, but we really didn't start focusing on the sources from terrestrial to aquatic system really until about 2013. So this is new, novel stuff, and it's science coming off the press that can inform what we do. So there have been a few papers on stormwater that are increasing over the years. Many people have looked at wastewater. Of all of the pathways, I'd say wastewater treatment plant effluent has been looked at the most. Industrial and agriculture, similar to stormwater, people are only slowly starting to understand this as a pathway to mitigate. So in my study, I didn't just look in the Great Lakes. I did look in Lake Ontario. I also looked in Chesapeake Bay, the Mississippi River, and the Sacramento Delta in California, just to see whether these patterns were similar across different ecosystems or different cities, different urban areas. So I'm going to walk through the results and talk about how I think they can inform mitigation and talk about some of the mitigation strategies that we've tried. So I'm going to show a lot of slides or graphs, that come from this study, but I'll try to walk through each one to make it clear what the main point of what I'm showing is. So within each of these 4 different water bodies, we focused in watersheds to sample runoff from agriculture, wastewater treatment plant effluent by going into the plant and collecting their effluent, and stormwater by collecting in the tributary as it was raining and as water was coming down. We quantified the microplastic inside each of these samples. And so what I'm showing you here is the amount of microplastic that was sampled just downstream of all of the sources. So in the Delta, in the river, in Lake Ontario or in Chesapeake Bay. And then the concentration of microplastic that we found in the different pathways, agriculture, stormwater, and wastewater. And I want you to notice 2 things. 1, the concentration in the pathways is higher than in the water body. That makes a lot of sense. It enters the water body and it dilutes. More importantly, the concentration that's found in the pathways varies across location. You can see that for Lake Ontario, stormwater and wastewater are the most important pathways. And if I was trying to decide how to mitigate, I would focus there. But if I'm in the Sacramento Delta or the Mississippi River, agriculture seems quite important. There's quite a lot of agriculture in these watersheds, and therefore this makes sense. So it's important to monitor locally to figure out how you can mitigate. Then all we're looking at here is the fact that there are differences in the types of plastics between the pathways. So in this case, the red dots are stormwater samples, the green are in the water body, the blue is the wastewater treatment plant, and the black is the agriculture. Here you can see it's defined by shapes. And what I want you to notice, the closer the points are to each other, the more similar the types of microplastics are in these samples. And so what I'm showing you here is that the sources that come to these different pathways vary. Now this graph is really confusing to look at, so let's just look at what's in the samples. So here you can see each box is a different location or region that we were working in. And each bar is a different type of sample. So the water body, the agriculture, the stormwater, or the wastewater. you'll notice that in agriculture, you tend to have quite a bit of fragments, and sometimes you have some more film, which is film is used on agriculture for mulch. What really stuck out to us, though, is that in the stormwater samples, you always have this dark red, and this is black rubbery particles. These we think are tire dust. And then in the wastewater, you tend to have more microfibers, and that's because washing our clothes, that water goes into the wastewater treatment plant and then goes out into the ecosystem. So here, just by looking at this, you can think of a couple ways to mitigate by maybe making the plastic mulch more sustainable or not using it when you don't need to, by finding some way to trap those rubber particles before they enter our system, and maybe by doing something to stop microfibers from leaving our laundry when we do the wash. And I can tell you that these trends were exactly what we saw in the San Francisco Bay as well, in a different study where we found that wastewater, while it was an important source, it gave 17 billion per year. This is an annual estimate. Stormwater was 7 trillion per year. So that stormwater load is 300 times greater than wastewater to the San Francisco Bay, and that in the wastewater, 50% were fibers, and in the stormwater, more than 50% were black rubbery particles. So just to give you a quick summary of that before we talk about solutions, number one, there are many pathways that bring microplastics into aquatic ecosystems, and it's important to know what these are because they can inform mitigation. Two, these pathways vary by location, suggesting that local monitoring is important. If you live in a city and you want to quantitatively reduce the amount of plastic coming off of your city into, in this case, a Great Lake, you want to monitor so you can see what type of contamination you have and where the most effective place is to act. 3 different pathways have different microplastic signatures that can be used to determine which pathways may be important drivers of contamination in a system. We talked about this. So combined, this information can inform local mitigation strategies. And I think for plastic pollution, I think for any environmental issue, people want to think about what is the one solution that we should do. And the reality is, probably for all environmental issues, is that there is no silver bullet solution. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy, and there's not just one thing we should do. So when it comes to plastic pollution, there's a lot of different strategies that we can implement at the same time. And what strategies we might choose might vary by location because they may be more appropriate in terms of economically or culturally, or just in terms of the sources that we have in our region. For example, if I don't live in a port or near a port that's a big fishing community, I might not be as worried about fishing gear, but I might be more worried about agriculture runoff if there's a lot of agriculture near where I live. And these different reduction strategies or mitigation strategies can kind of be binned into 3 different types, if you will. One is plastic waste reduction. So that means maybe banning different types of plastic, maybe the kind that are hard to recycle, that aren't necessary, that have an easy replacement. It could also be maybe having recycling programs so that things are left out of the landfill and you're reducing that waste and it's kept in a circular economy. Increasing waste management is often increasing collection and also having waste management that actually contains the plastic and doesn't allow for leakage. And then cleanup. Cleanup is actually really important. There's a lot of studies that suggest, or maybe not studies, but you'll hear that cleanup is only important for education and outreach, and I 100% disagree. I think cleanup, yes, is very important for education and outreach. It absolutely raises awareness. It's wonderful for that purpose, but it also is cleaning up, and it is diverting plastic out of our ecosystem. And no matter how well we increase our waste management system, there will always be some leakage, in which case I think there always needs to be some cleanup. So I'm going to go through some examples of some solutions that we've tested and that we think work. I'll talk a little bit about some others that we haven't tested, but that are being used in different places. And then hopefully we can have a discussion and have time for questions to think about what you're thinking about in your own city and ways in which we can make a difference there. So the first thing we tested has to do with stormwater runoff. So this is in the San Francisco Bay where I talked before about what we found. These are just concentrations of microplastic that we found in the stormwater there. And we thought, could rain gardens or bioretention cells reduce the amount of microplastic that's running off the road before it enters into the bay? And so if you're unfamiliar with rain gardens or bioretention cells, first of all, they add nice green infrastructure. They look pretty when they're sitting on the sidewalk. But as the water runs down the drain and enters this, it goes through the actual garden and the soil, and it spends some time in there before it is filtered in and runs into your body of water. And so it acts like a filter. For pesticides and organic contaminants, the organic contaminant binds to the organics in the soil. For microplastics, they'll get trapped in the soil and it'll be filtered out. And here you can see that we measured the influent that was heading into this rain garden, and then we measured the effluent. And you can see the concentrations are much lower. And in fact, 90% of the microplastics in the influent were reduced from the effluent. So bioretention cells in cities are a really good way, or permeable pavement, some sort of green infrastructure for stormwater, can reduce the amount of particles in stormwater. And also these similar types of things that can be placed by agricultural runoff can also reduce the amount of plastics in that runoff as well. So that's one solution that we tested. Another one is for those microfibers at the wastewater treatment plant. As I said, washing our clothes is a source of microfibers or microplastic into the environment. As we do our laundry, you can imagine the lint trap in your dryer. You know you clean that out. It's a fire hazard. It's important. But that same thing happens in your washing machine, but it's not filtered out and it's in the water. So you can imagine a wet mess of microfibers that's going out to the wastewater treatment plant. If you use a filter in your washing machine, in this case, it's an aftermarket filter that we applied to the washing machine. There are some washing machine manufacturers that are making them in the washing machine. It traps those filters, those fibers, and then it needs to be cleaned out. We found that from the number of microfibers in our washing machines without a filter was around 5,000 fibers per liter. And with a filter, I'll talk about this one in a second, but with a filter, you can see a large reduction, again, about a 90% reduction here of the microfibers that were going out of the wash with the filter. This one is called a Filtrol. Another brand is a Lint Lover. You can buy them online. Yes, we can get individuals to purchase these and put them in their homes, but I also think legislation to ask washing machine manufacturers to put them on the washing machine is a fantastic idea. This is a different strategy. It's called a Coraball. It's a ball that you buy and you put it in your washing machine. It reduces microfibers from the wash as well, but it's not as efficient as the filter. So this is a great product, but we really recommend filters on washing machines. One of the last ones that we've tested and that I'll talk about, and this is one of my favorites because it's an amazing education and outreach tool, as well as literally diverting plastics from the water body, are trash caps. And these can include, if you're familiar with the trash wheel in Baltimore, so Mr. Trash Wheel, it can be sea bins. Here's a picture of a sea bin that we deployed here in the harbor in Toronto. It can be booms, which aren't as pretty and fun, but they work. And then there's another product that actually goes in a storm drain called a litter trap. And what these do is, in the case of Boom and Mr. Trash Wheel, it sits at the end of a river. And as the water pushes down the river before it goes into Baltimore Harbor in this case, or Toronto Harbor in this case, it traps the floatables. So all of the floatable litter will go up this ramp into a dumpster behind, and the clean water goes out the other end. In Baltimore, this was an amazing success. They now have 4 Mr. Trash Wheels. They all have different names and personas. They have tens of thousands of Twitter followers, and it's an amazing education and outreach tool. In Toronto, our sea bins also attract quite a lot of attention. Not quite as much as the googly eyes. Maybe we should put googly eyes on them. But when we're out there quantifying and characterizing the waste, we get a lot of questions, a lot of people wanting to learn more. And as I said, we collect in these a lot of those pellets, which means they trap microplastics. So we find maybe 10 to 20 pieces of large plastic in every sea bin in a 24-hour period, and hundreds to thousands of particles of microplastics in a 24 to 48-hour period. So these are great. Now, of course, these aren't the only solutions, right? So there are many other solutions, which include increasing or improving your waste management infrastructure in your city. trying to have a truly circular economy. So maybe incentivizing recycling, or maybe not procuring products that can't be recycled. Incentivizing the return of fishing gear if fishing is a industry in your community. Reducing single-use plastics, increasing awareness, so education and outreach programs, incentivizing recycling I mentioned, and cleanup. And I don't think any one of these should be used in isolation. I think the more the merrier. But as we work together, no matter what the mitigation strategies that we choose to adopt, we all need to work together in terms of talking, creating solutions together, and making sure that they work. And so this includes working with scientists, but also working with industry and waste managers. And so I think this is especially important as we try to build a circular economy, or really change the how we make, how we use, and how we waste plastics. We all have to work together to make sure that what we're producing matches the waste management system, and that we're also educating the community to make sure they know how to put that waste in its proper place. So working together is really, really important. And I think at the government level, putting policies in place to facilitate those collaborations and lay the foundation for mitigation strategies is really important. So that means, of course, thinking globally, but acting locally. So as I said earlier, I really, really do believe that cities can lead. I think cities have an opportunity to really basically become the leaders on this issue. And I think that they can have different goals to prevent measurable emissions of plastic waste. So this could be a goal of 100% waste collection and capture. It could be trying to reduce the amount of waste that goes to landfill, to have more go into your blue bin or green bin, or whatever colors they are for recycling and compost. Harmonizing the waste, maybe across the cities within your state, or maybe nationally, if that's an opportunity. That makes it easier for people to understand how to put waste in a proper place. It makes it easier for industry as well to procure products that are more sustainable. Creating waste literate communities is really important, I think, so that people know how to throw and where to throw the waste away, and formalize litter cleanup like a sea bin or a trash wheel. One thing I don't have on here, but that I think is really important, is extended producer responsibility. That is where the people who produce the plastic are also paying for the way that you mitigate the waste. And so that's maybe paying into some of the waste management system. A way you can then incentivize industry to make products that are more compatible with the recycling facility or the compost facility is to have them pay less when that product matches a more sustainable end of life, and have them pay more when it doesn't. That's something that's being adopted in some parts of Canada. And right now in Ontario, through extended producer responsibility, industry pays for 50% of our waste management, which will increase to 100% pretty soon. So extended producer responsibility has honestly not been very popular in the United States. I'm from the United States, and I worked there for quite a long time and still do some work there. However, it's becoming not a bad word anymore, and people are discussing it. And so I think soon we'll actually start to see some of that in the United States as well. So overall, of course, we all have a shared goal to reduce the amount of plastic going into the ocean, and so in this case, I should have changed the slide, into our Great Lakes. And so the question is really, how can we work together to get there from where we are today? So we do still have time for questions, which was my goal, because I think it's really good and important to have a discussion. So I will leave my slides up in case anyone wants to ask questions about them, but I would love to take some questions and have time for a discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Chelsea. Yes, we have some questions. So we have about 15 minutes. So I'm gonna start at the beginning. So there's a couple questions that have talked about educating the public about plastic pollution and recycling. So what are some challenges when we are trying to educate the public about this issue? And I'm happy to touch base too.
Great. Okay. So I'll give an answer, and then Jill, maybe you can give an answer after me. So we try to do this a lot through our U of T trash team. And I guess there's two things I can think of that are really important. One, I think it's really important for the public to be waste literate. And what I mean by that is for people to understand the products that we use, how to throw them away in a sustainable way, right? Knowing what goes in the recycle bin, what goes in the landfill bin, what goes in a compost bin if you have one, and where they actually go after that process, so that they have, you know, knowledge is power. And if they can understand that whole process, then maybe they can purchase products that only go in those blue and those green bins. The other thing I think is really important, and maybe being waste literate helps with that, is to understand all the different mitigation strategies, and that there's more to just banning different types of products. Banning single-use products that can reduce the amount of waste that we produce is important, but it's only one part of the solution. And I think right now the public, it would be better for people to really understand a more holistic set of solutions, which includes, say, extended producer responsibility, which include creating more recyclable products that are truly recycled, and buying products that are made from recycled materials. So that's what I would say. I think the challenge there is maybe trying to get it formalized in schools, so we start this education early. But Jill is an expert in this from Sea Grant, so Jill, why don't you take a second crack at that one?
Chelsea, great points. We really need to educate ourselves better about what happens to stuff when we throw it away, because I think people just think that it goes away magically and it doesn't cause any issues. So there was some talk about behavior change. So I think with this issue, what's so important is, yes, people can get very depressed by all environmental issues, but this one, the individual has the opportunity to make a huge change. So we're not asking you to put solar panels, drive electric cars, spend a ton of money. We're actually trying to get you to save money by using your own bottles that you probably have at home, using your own bags that you probably already have, buying less items in general, consuming less. So really, it's very simple steps you can take at home, at work, in your family, at your school. And when millions and billions of people do it, that's a huge amount of waste that is being saved from leakage into the natural environment. So that's the step us educators take. We focus on the individual actions that you can take, and we also talk about money, because people don't want to, you know, sometimes when you're trying to be more sustainable, it eventually does cost you more. Whereas plastics, it's usually the opposite, which is actually really nice. So thank you for those questions on education. If you have any more questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me. This is what I do, and I'm locally based in Cleveland, so I'm happy to answer any more questions about that. Okay, so we had some recycling questions. So one is, have there been any partnerships with waste collection / management companies to reduce the amount of plastic that goes directly to landfill?
That's a good question. It's hard for me to answer locally because I don't live in Ohio. Do you want to answer that one, Jill?
Sure. So what's being done locally is really we're focusing actually on reusable bags, because they are just awful when they get to waste management. They clog systems, they blow around, they are just a nuisance. The two solid waste districts, Cuyahoga County and Lake County, have actually been working with Sea Grant, City of Cleveland, to educate people about using their own bags. They've been giving away free reusable bags to people that need them, to really remove plastic bags from the waste stream. Also, there are special collection days. So these are for electronics, hazardous items, but these are plastic items that have valuable metals inside of them. So they're going to people to try to remove those from the waste stream. Hopefully that answered your question. Based on COVID, is plastic use getting worse during COVID? Are we seeing more plastic in the environment because of COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's worthy of talking about, right? So yes, waste has increased with COVID. There's data on this. The City of Toronto collected their own data, but I've also seen articles in the newspaper from New York and other cities around the United States. Waste has increased, and it's from two reasons, right? So of course, using single-use PPE is one of them. But the other thing is people are ordering more through the mail. They're going and getting more takeout. And some places, grocery stores, coffee shops, are no longer allowing you to bring your own mug or your own bag. So this is one of just a unfortunate negative issue of COVID. And I hope that as we tackle this issue of COVID-19, that we build back in a way where we reduce our waste instead of increasing our waste. But the one thing I will say is that sustainable PPE is possible, right? So using cotton masks, there's no evidence that suggests that the disposable face mask is safer. And there's also, it is not true that, COVID sticks more or less to plastic. And so using a reusable grocery bag is okay. And so trying to maybe change government rules, if you have them in Cleveland, around being able to bring your own reusable bag, that is safe. I know here in Toronto they allow it, but they still don't let us bring our own coffee mugs. Maybe that one's fair. So it's just trying to think about how can we still be as sustainable as possible during this time, and then make a plan for in the future as we pivot out of this to pivot in a way that's more sustainable than the past.
So locally, we are now allowed to start using our own bags again. Also, January, the bag ban should be going back into effect. So we're going to see progress towards that. I also did a little bit of research around this, and consumers actually felt safest using their own bags during COVID pandemic, but they weren't allowed to. So there is no evidence, like you said, from health experts or from consumers that reusable bags should ever have been taken away from use in grocery stores. So we have a question now about tires. So are there any OSHA standards for tire manufacturing / plastic manufacturing, or safety data sheets for chemicals used in products that could be used to help better understand how the products will impact things that live in the water? So I guess
so OSHA standards like occupational health and safety, that's a really good question. I think if I understand this question properly, we're asking, like, is there information from OSHA that shows what chemicals may be used in the plastic manufacturing that could be hazardous to the health of the employees, to inform what might be going on when that plastic gets into the world? Unfortunately, I don't think that data is public. So it's pretty hard to get an MSDS sheet from a plastic manufacturer. And part of the reason is because the formula that they use is proprietary. It's part of the competition that they have between other companies. So only if a chemical is used, I think, above 1% of the weight of the plastic, does that information have to be public. But I like this idea, and I might dig into it a little bit more to try to understand how to figure out those chemical formulations, because it's a tricky one. And I'm not sure if I answered that question fully. Jill, do you think there's more to that?
I don't really know anything from production. I just do know, when we look at these ethylene cracker plants, that people living around these environments are exposed to all kinds of toxins. So I can only assume that in the manufacturing of plastics, workers are exposed to the same toxins. So Chelsea, if you find information on this, please feel free to share it with Kathy or I, and we will get it to the people who asked this question. And then a really quick one: how often do you need to change that filter on the washing machine?
It really depends on how often you do laundry, but it's really only about every 2 weeks. It's not every day.
So this is a more local one to my area, so I'll try to answer this. But what government agency monitors Lake Erie pollution at source point or in the lake for Ohio and Northeast Ohio? Do we monitor plastic particles or other chemicals such as mercury? So it really just depends on where you are. But if you're talking about intake water, that's going to be monitored by the City of Cleveland Water. That's they have to, adhere to EPA standards. If you're looking at beaches, that's going to be the local health authority or the EPA. So it really just depends on where you are. But to my knowledge, as far as water effluent, we do not manage for plastic particles. However, with water, there are filters and stuff in place to manage plastic particles. However, some of these plastic particles still do get through filtration systems, and that's how they end up in our tap water and bottled water. I'm sorry, I cannot answer your questions on chemicals, but that would most likely be the EPA or the local health authority. All right. Another recycling question. So recycling, they used to have the triangle with the numbers in them. Why did that disappear? And we thought we could recycle carryout containers and grocery containers, but we can't do that anymore. So why did this happen? This is the bulk of plastic I use in my house.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that triangle number system was invented, I think, by someone in Wisconsin actually in the 70s, and it was to tell people what type of plastic they were using. The fact that it had a recycle symbol on it makes a lot of people think that that means it's recyclable. Now, there's a difference between something being recyclable and being recyclable where you live and having a market that takes it. So how you can recycle things varies all across the place. So and these products are made and then they're sold all over the United States, for example. So those recycle symbols actually were quite confusing, because the real way to know what you can and can't recycle is to look in your city. So Jill, just for fun, can you recycle plastic bags at home in Cleveland?
No, you have to take them to the grocery store.
Okay, and in Toronto you can. We can put them in our blue bin. So here's another one just for fun. Can you put black plastic in your recycle bin in Cleveland?
No.
We cannot either. Okay. Can you put compostable plastic in your, do you have a green bin?
We do not have curbside composting. We have Rust Belt riders.
Yeah, but see, it really varies. So you have to go on your city's website and look at what you can put in the recycle bin. And this is why they took those off, because they were almost spreading misinformation.
Yeah, so I can talk more about that locally. Actually, today from 1 to 2 o'clock, there is a recycling in Cleveland. This is such a hot topic for us. But in regards to plastics for Cleveland, you can recycle bags if you take them to the grocery store, water bottles, jugs, or tubs. So these are going to be those thicker plastics, but please ignore the recycling symbol and the number. And I know people try to do the best and they try to recycle everything, but then you contaminate that recycling, and then that's what often sends recyclable materials to landfill. But I encourage you to join the session from 1 to 10, because we will have our recycling experts and you can ask them all the recycling questions you want. All right, Chelsea, so we have a question about the rain gardens. That was a new tool to me to capture microplastics, which I think is very interesting. But do you have to discard that soil or whatever material is in that rain guard as it collects plastic? And if so, how do you discard of it?
That's a good question. Yeah, you do have to discard it. So there's a kind of a time stamp on how long these things can be out before they need to be cleaned. But they've been used for a while in cities for chemical contaminants. And so they are disposed of, I don't know the answer to exactly how you do it because it varies by city, but they're disposed of in a way similar to the way you dispose of like a hazardous substance. So eventually that soil gets bagged up or put into a barrel and sent somewhere, and then you reset your rain garden.
Only have a couple minutes left, so I really want to focus on a question I had and then a question I saw in the chat about some new technology that we're trying to either recycle waste or get rid of plastic waste. So the first one is about the worms that eat plastic. Whoa, are these real? And then also plastic roads. Is it a good idea to take our plastic waste and pave roads with it?
Yeah, those are both good, hard, heady questions. So I think with the worms, I mean, yes, it is real that we are finding that some organisms have the enzymes that can break down plastic. And we even see in the ocean with plastic over time, they kind of get these like pits and crevices, which are from microbial activity breaking down and using plastic as a carbon source. The issue is that it's slow. I don't necessarily think we should like release worms or microbes into the world to get rid of the plastic that we throw on the ground. The real solution is to not allow it to discard in the first place. However, for plastics that, you know, for some products, it's hard to think about how we can produce a recyclable product. And maybe that product is not one that maybe it's one that we need. So think about like medical waste, for example. We are using plastic in hospitals for good reason. So maybe you have a waste treatment facility that has those worms and you have it contained. So that's kind of my thought on like degradation by animals. Plastic roads, it's a really tricky one because you can't recycle plastics into everything, right? And so there are some real value into turning plastic into bricks to build homes, or turning plastics into roads. And plastic in roads can, in some ways, make roads more durable. The issue is that the roads break down over time, and we see road wear in our samples. So I think the jury's still out on this one. There's some research being done. They're being used before that research is understood. So I think I would say, like, slow down. But yeah, I don't have a clear answer to that one.
We're at our time, but one quick question that I can answer really quickly. It talks about buyback programs, so bottle buyback programs like what they have in Michigan where you get 10 cents. Yes, these have proven to prevent plastics or cans from making their way to landfill because they're high value to the consumer. Also, we typically, my counterparts in Michigan have said they typically do not find bottles and cans on beach cleanups. There is still some leakage, but again, because these are high value items to the individual, and these take back programs happen at their grocery store, so it's really easy. I was just in Michigan, and the amount of people putting their recyclables back in there was really amazing. So I think this would be great policy to see spread as a nationwide program versus a state individual program. So just a quick answer to that. I just want to thank everyone. Thank you, Chelsea. This was amazing information. I hope people got some great information. I know I learned a lot. The next session begins at 10:45. And just like I said, if you have recycling questions, there is that session from 1 to 2 today. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Applause to Chelsea. Yay.
Thank you.